Welcome back to Sissy Maya. Make sure to subscribe to our channel to never miss an update. Additionally, consider subscribing to my Patreon to get access to these features, and much more.
Life is a strange thing, Whistley thought, recalling Conrad's words, a baffling arrangement of logic for an ultimately pointless reason. The words echoed in his mind as he sprinted past the corner and down the cluttered alley. Piles of junk, broken car fenders, and old mattresses slowed him down, but he pushed through, ignoring the pain in his chest. As he maneuvered around the obstacles, he disturbed a few rats, knocking over an old frame that crashed to the ground. The cop, gasping for air, appeared at the alley entrance, his gun raised. Whistley crouched as he ran, but the sight of the cop aiming made him freeze in fear. "What the hell?" he gasped, his eyes wide with disbelief. The bullets zipped above his head, their trajectory clear as the sound of their impact struck the brick wall. The adrenaline surged, this was real. Blood dripped from Whistley's torn Macy stylos where he had scraped his shin. He couldn't go any further. Stopping and pressing himself against the wall, he tried to catch his breath. It was one of those moments when he felt like giving up, as he had so many times before in his life. His will to fight was gone. His heart pounding, he glanced back at the cop, who was bent over and looking at him with a mix of determination and exhaustion. As they locked eyes, the cop suddenly started choking, clutching his chest in pain. Whistley watched in shock as the cop turned purple, then collapsed with a thud. The sound of sirens in the distance echoed through the darkening alley. Rats, drawn by the smell of death, began to gather around Officer Stokely's body. Whistley, now hesitant, moved cautiously past the junk piles, but the rats scattered at his approach, leaving only the stiffening body behind. A radio attached to the officer's belt emitted static, but the voices were distant, as if the world had moved on without him. Whistley could hardly believe it, the officer was dead. He nudged the body with his foot, only to be met with the pungent smell of urine. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked, his voice shaking as he looked down at the corpse. A groan responded, and Whistley stumbled back in shock, his pulse racing. "Goddamn," he cursed, turning to flee, but not before kicking the officer's handgun away from the body. It skidded across the pavement. A few moments ago, he had wanted the officer to end it all for him, but now he was here, in this bizarre reality. He stared at the lifeless body and muttered, "I'll never do that again," as he walked away. The rats waited until he was gone, then returned to scavenge the alley. Wanamaker. The name carried a grim history. Once, he had been a frail, scrawny kitten with a rough, neglected life. His coat had been matted and filthy, his yellow-veined eyes full of madness. The collar that once marked him as a pet now hung loosely around his neck, its bell tinkling with each movement. He had once been loved by foolish owners, hippie yuppies who thought a stoned kitten and 2 dogs would make for a fun household. But they had forgotten all about their pets while they partied, and in that time, Wanamaker had killed and eaten the dogs. Now, 25 years later, Wanamaker was an apex predator. The acid his previous owners had given him had warped his mind, but it had also made him stronger. He had survived starvation, disease, and even a brutal injury when his tail had been ripped off. He was ruthless, but he also owed his life to one person, Whistley. The idea that they might meet again seemed too impossible to even dream about. Tri-City was vast, and they had long since traveled different paths. But fate had other plans. From his perch on the roof of an abandoned hospital, Wanamaker watched the usual chaos unfold in the streets below. Police sirens blared in the distance as an overweight man hurried across the street from an alley. Something caught the cat's attention, and he paused, sensing something in the air. When Tanya was released from jail, she was in no mood for anything but trouble. Bona was waiting for her, and Tanya's face was grim as she walked toward him. He opened the car door for her, and she slid into the cramped front seat of the Toyota, settling in as best as she could. She had spent the weekend in Central, witnessing things that no young girl should ever see. Furious, she could barely speak, but Bona, as usual, was half asleep, which drained all her energy, leaving her with nothing but frustration. "What's going on?" she asked sharply. "I don't know," Boner replied, a half-smile flickering on his face. He drove toward the house, clearly amused at the potential drama that awaited when Dandy returned. Joe had warned Boner to stay away from the place that evening, so he didn't witness Tanya and Miss Bitch being hauled away by the undercover unit. The police's suspicions were confirmed by drug tests. The two women were users. Tanya's calls from jail had kept Boner's metabolism busy, but Tanya and Miss Bitch had spent the entire week insulting him, playing cruel games of verbal abuse. Now, she needed his help to get Dandy out of jail, bail her out, and protect her from the monstrous figures who had treated her cruelly. Boner relished his power over Tanya, though he had no clue what had really happened to Dandy. Dandy had gone to Douglas Road on Friday morning, leaving Boner with instructions to stand by. Boner had done just that, waiting until he got the call from Joe. Boner didn't mess with the cops. When he first heard about the police raid, he had been terrified. The pantry was filled with stolen demos, and Boner feared the consequences if Whistley found out. But now, it didn't matter, because Dandy seemed to have disappeared, leaving Boner alone in charge of the empty house after spending the night in his car. Joe had called on Saturday, confirming Tanya's release for Sunday afternoon, with one instruction: don't tell her anything. "Understand?" "Yes, officer," Boner had replied. While not the sharpest tool in the shed, Boner quickly understood that he was caught in a complicated situation, a triangle between two middle-aged men, one a cop, both in love with a woman who only turned to them when she needed something. Boner had watched as Dandy fell in love with Tanya, and he had witnessed Tanya take advantage of the old fool, ignoring all the warnings about her manipulative ways. But Boner couldn't deny that there was something about Tanya, her elegance, her breathless beauty, and a kind of sincerity that made her captivating. She was cute in a messy, casual way, with dirty blonde hair that framed her face. She had met Joe when her favorite pub had been raided by locals, and the police sergeant had stepped in to protect her. For Tanya, Joe was her knight in shining armor, someone who understood her, though Whistley never knew about the secret bond between Tanya and the law. Boner, as Dandy's right-hand man, wasn't supposed to know either, but Tanya had made it clear she needed someone to serve her, someone who would listen to her threats about the consequences of crossing her. Survival always came first for Boner. It wasn't his business, after all. Wanamaker's sense of smell stirred with confusion, catching a faint trace in the air. Something old, buried for years, twitched to life. The cat paused, snarling as he tried to pin down the scent. His mind, swirling with madness, searched for the source. He stood on his hind legs, sniffing the air, tasting the remnants of something lost. His senses were overloaded, but he slowly calmed himself, planting his front paws on the edge of the eave, savoring the familiar aroma. Jack Dandy. It didn't hit him all at once. Wanamaker simply knew. Years of time vanished in an instant. The cat looked down from the building, then sprang off the riser. The dusty air cushioned his fall, and with a crash, his paws scattered shards of glass as he hit the ground. His senses locked onto the trail, and with a sound like a bell ringing, Wanamaker silently moved across the street. Joe's son, Kyle Raymond, had probationary status on the police force, though to the untrained eye, it was hard to tell. His mother dismissed questions about his badge's authority, seeing his success as nothing short of winning the lottery. Kyle's application, initially lost among thousands, had been mysteriously selected for the sweet pile, bypassing any further career hindrances. Like many of his fellow officers, Kyle's father, Joe, had connections that made his son's career path a little too easy. Kyle's mother, Lulu Raymond, was a strong-willed woman who never hesitated to express her disdain for Joe, in her words, the man who deserved the contempt he got. Even though they were married, Lulu refused to take his last name, and Joe often complained that her feminist attitude had hindered his career prospects. Lulu, of course, disagreed, and she bluntly explained that Joe's failure had nothing to do with her. He was Joe the Yo-Yo, a nickname that summed up his lack of ambition. Over time, Kyle had grown used to hearing his mother's sharp words about his father. By the time he was a teenager, he had even joined in the verbal jabs, though his taunts were tempered by the understanding that JoJo's influence had been the only thing that helped Kyle get into the police force and stay there, despite his consistently subpar performance. Kyle would have felt worse about his lackluster scores if he hadn't known that most of his classmates had failed out as well. The real question everyone asked was, could they handle the tough stuff? And Kyle and his classmates had that covered. If nothing else, they could definitely kick ass, as older officers liked to remind them. Kyle wasn't a coward, but he sure felt nervous when JoJo assigned him what he called a little job. JoJo's instructions were simple. The big man was supposed to show up around midnight. Kyle could use force if necessary, though JoJo said the man was a coward, despite his size. Kyle felt exposed in his casual street clothes, his heart racing as the car pulled into the driveway. Whistley drove into the garage, opening the electric door, and Kyle, legs heavy as lead, rushed in before it closed. Whistley acted as though being caught was routine, telling him to get outta here several times when Kyle confronted him. The garage was dark, and as the door shut, the space became pitch black. For a moment, Kyle couldn't even see Whistley, his panic rising, until the lights flicked on. Whistley even commented on the fort sensor, joking that Kyle should stick to Sears Progress if he ever needed to buy one. The whole experience felt surreal, arresting and handcuffing Whistley, shoving him into the trunk, then fumbling with the garage door while the man inside made ridiculous comments. Kyle searched through the dashboard of Whistley's car, struggling to figure out how to open the door, then finally yelled questions at him from the back seat. He was relieved when it was all over, but had no idea what the whole mess was about. He tried to convince himself that this was a strange, temporary situation, even as he dragged the well-to-do stranger away with a fake warrant. When he got home, he locked himself in the closet and fell asleep, though he woke up, as usual, feeling strangely refreshed. Whistley's paranoia was justified. In just a few weeks, his life had unraveled completely. He had gone from being a respected, successful member of society to someone at risk of being executed like an animal. He walked through the growing shadows of a desolate street, unsure of where he was. He knew it was one of the abandoned neighborhoods, obvious from the decaying surroundings. If he kept walking straight, he'd eventually come to a boarded-up fence topped with barbed wire, an indication he had entered a redevelopment zone still fiercely contested by corporations. These areas were notoriously hard to enter, with private property and no trespassing signs scrawled in messy paint on barriers, meant to deter decent folks while signaling to the criminal element that they were welcome. Whistley knew this area all too well. Just a few weeks ago, he had been involved in high-stakes deals for neighborhoods like this one, working with a team to analyze prospects for areas like Creek River. The thought of being back here made him shudder. What if this was Creek River? He and his colleagues had once laughed at the easy pickings in a neighborhood abandoned by its residents, pushed out by crooked deals made by their elected officials. What amused them even more was the idea that the thugs who had taken over places like Creek River actually believed they were tough. Whistley stood in the quiet night, haunted by the ghosts of the people who had once lived here, the innocents lost when they were forced out. He spotted an open doorway and slipped inside, cautiously scanning the wrecked interior. A couple of feral cats hissed at him before bolting through a broken window. Hungry, exhausted, and covered in grime, he wasn't in the mood for more trouble. He just needed a place to settle until morning, so he made his way toward the back of the building. It looked like an old office, or maybe a school. A dark hallway extended from the front room, and a half-open door beckoned a short distance down the hall. Whistley poked his head inside, ensuring it was safe. Sucking in his gut, he slipped into what appeared to be a ruined classroom. Despite the damage, it was surprisingly intact, with a window letting in enough light to see. Whistley leaned against the door and pushed it shut. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a sense of safety. As he settled in among the wreckage, he reflected on the whirlwind he'd been caught in. He had been let down, no doubt about it. Using his Stanley Perrin sport coat as a blanket, he huddled on some cardboard he found, bitterly resenting the society that had wronged him and the dirty bastards who populated it. He couldn't believe it, he'd had to drink water from a puddle just to quench his thirst. J.D. Whistley, once a rising professional, reduced to drinking filthy water from a goddamn puddle. Anger bubbled up, pushing away the exhaustion. He started mentally ticking off the people he was going to take down, beginning with Rose. His wife. Short, dumpy, and miserable. He'd married her when she had an ass he couldn't resist, but that was before everything fell apart. She took his house in Wilsonburg, along with everything else. When he needed her, she was there all right like a vulture, picking him clean. Whistley snorted angrily as the memories hit him. It all happened so fast. Joan had handed him a letter with the words "read it and weep" before tossing it in his face. "Let go for reasons of fiscal economy," the note said, followed by best wishes. Rage surged in his chest as he remembered Joan summoning a pair of chuckling security guards to escort him out. Then, he had to go home and break the news to Rose, who was there with his former best friend, Tom. The scene that followed was a goddamn nightmare. His anger raged uselessly. Rose hid behind Sanchez, who glared at Whistley coldly as he threatened to lunge at her. He had planned to gently break the news, to reassure her, but it all fell apart. Whistley kicked at a dog-eared notebook just out of reach, shaking with frustration as he relived the horror. Somewhere in the middle of it all, as he fought back tears in front of his wife and ex-friend, a new emotion crept in: fear. He'd been so goddamn stupid to trust that crazy woman. He struck his head with clenched fists, tears of shame and sorrow filling his eyes. The damage she'd done to their marriage was nearly impossible to grasp. She emptied their joint accounts, sold his stock portfolios, including the precious RHS he'd spent 10 years building, mortgaged their house, cashed in his retirement savings, and sold the Clairway Isle cottage months ago. She had run up all his credit cards and hidden the notices until he was financially ruined. She even helped spread rumors that gave Rill, Hamburg, and Scott the excuse they needed to fire him with cause after 11 years of hard work. And Tom Sanchez, his so-called childhood friend, was living in his house, screwing his wife, driving his Grand Torino, spending his money, and then stabbing him in the back by taking his job. Whistley groaned aloud, pretending he was suffering from a heart attack, his face soaked in tears. But no one was there to witness his pain. The bad news never stopped coming. He fled to Tri-City because, at least there, some of his assets had survived the vultures, and he needed Tanya. Tanya. In a way, she had earned her keep just by being there. Had Whistley not hidden her away, moving some assets so she was out of Rose's reach, he'd be lost. He had even set up secret companies to keep her protected. He had retained the Tri-City house, though mortgaged, and a few dollars that Rose and Tom would have gotten their hands on if he hadn't done so. Without that, he'd be living with Bona in Bona's dirty car. And now this, kidnapped and nearly killed. The injustices piled up in Whistley's mind, but it was too much. Suddenly, he was overcome by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and collapsed into the one refuge left to the broken-hearted, a deep, untroubled sleep. Lulu trembled with satisfaction. She had earned this moment, having put up with nonsense for most of her chaotic life. At over 40, she felt it was about time she enjoyed herself after years of self-sacrifice for others with nothing in return. Jojo still hadn't shown up, but to Lulu, that was no concern. She still saw herself as a fairly attractive woman and believed she deserved so much more from life than it had given her. She came from what she proudly referred to as trailer trash, and most of her friends were from similar backgrounds. Like them, she had married into either the police or fire departments. Her schemes had been simple over the years: affairs with Jojo's partners, Lu's, and an occasional suspect thrown in just to stir up drama. Everyone in the department did it. The force was like a soap opera, something to gossip about. But Lulu knew the real action was higher up. That's where the important decisions were made: budgets, salaries, promotions. Street cops like Jojo were just pawns in a much bigger game. Though the police force called itself a brotherhood, it was really just a system of winners and losers, like life itself. Lulu had come to understand this over time. It was strange, feeling both pride and shame about her roots. She resented being looked down on, especially by the wives of the brass, who wore expensive clothes and looked down on her. Jojo's only redeeming quality was that he was a cop. When she was younger, that had been enough. But now, she couldn't stand him anymore. So, she devised a plan that energized her like nothing before, and it seemed like she might actually pull it off. When she found out about Jojo's affair, it was almost too much to process. Jojo was no risk-taker, and the fact that he'd gotten involved with someone else shook her. Lulu decided to do some investigating of her own and quickly pieced together what was going on. It was hard to believe that Jojo was even a police officer. Once, while following him too closely in her sister's car, she accidentally bumped his bumper. He glanced back with a sour look but didn't recognize her. He was such a fool. Lulu even disguised her voice to leave messages for him, which he accepted without a second thought. Then there was Dandelion, of all people. An idiot she knew from her younger days, and now a big shot in some financial firm with plenty of money. Jojo's lover, it turned out, was involved with Dandelion's household in Tri-City, even though Dandy was married with a home in Wilsonburg. Jojo, like a dog, sniffed around them. It was too perfect. By listening in on phone calls between Jojo and Tanya, Lulu learned that Jojo was jealous of Dandelion, so jealous he was willing to risk everything. He'd come home, see Lulu sleeping on the couch, then rush upstairs to use the phone. Lulu had a twinned cell phone set up, a replacement for the one Jojo had supposedly lost, and she listened in as Tanya, or rather Larry, led Jojo by the nose. Tanya told him that Dandy was planning to divorce his wife and had already changed his will to name her as the sole beneficiary, with Whistley supposedly naming her as the beneficiary of his life insurance policies too, all proof of how much he loved her. Lulu could hear Jojo's jealousy bubbling over, grinding his teeth as Tanya spun her lies. He actually believed her, convinced that she loved him but needed Dandelion's wealth to secure her future. Then there was Bone, a handyman of sorts for Jack Whistley, with whom Jojo had these ridiculous, tough guy conversations. One time, Jojo said something so absurd that Lulu laughed out loud, causing a moment of awkward silence before the conversation abruptly ended. It was priceless. Lulu loved her son, but she didn't hold much hope for him. The important thing was that he had gotten into the department, just like his father, who had been rabbied into the force by his own father. Like father, like son. Kyle didn't have the strength of will to help with her plans, but he kept her informed. Jojo had arranged for the girls to be out of the way when Dandelion was arrested on suspicion of drug trafficking. Jojo stashed him in an undercover safe house while Tanya's alibi was prepared, and then he planned to get rid of Dandy in the Old Creek River area. That's when Lulu would make her move, taking everything and disappearing to greener pastures. She had carefully documented everything, taping enough evidence to destroy Jojo if he didn't follow her instructions. When Tanya reaped the benefits from Dandelion's robbery and murder, Lulu would use Tanya's addiction as leverage to make Jojo funnel the money her way. Kyle would just have to take care of Jojo and his bitch after Lulu cleaned them out. Lulu relished the details of her plan, especially the image of herself riding off into a life of freedom and wealth. As the night wore on, she imagined the look on Jojo's face when she finally told him off for good. Wanamaker tracked the faint memory of Jack Dandy. A leaking pipe had formed a wet spot near the curb, and the scent, along with the image of a long-haired, goateed youth, lingered heavily in the air, stirring the dying embers of an old memory. Wanamaker prowled around, licking the moisture from the ground, his mangled 3-foot-long body twisting as he circled the puddle again and again. The bell around his neck rang softly as he moved, stopping at the spot where Jack Dandy had stood moments before, drinking the water from the same place. The cat crouched low, its cold eyes scanning the area, exuding a chilling aura that warned anything nearby to stay away. The brutalized creature dropped its head, revealing its mangled tongue, which it sloppily dipped into the water. Its legs spread wide, it drank, raising its head while water dripped from its exposed jaw, before dropping its head once more to continue drinking. Nearby, Whistley slept, unaware. Whistley was in his late 20s, and although he had a certain fixation on Rose, Jack wasn't worried. He knew Rose's true feelings. Sitting in someone's front room, the guy turned to Jack and remarked that his eyes were too close together, like the eyes of a devil. Jack, irritated, jumped up to get a closer look and mocked, "What's wrong with your ear?" He pulled back quickly, pointing and saying, "Look at this, you've got a growth, probably cancer." "No kidding. Better you than me, pal." The guy touched his ear, a worried look crossing his face, but Jack just laughed. "Poor bastard, even you don't deserve to go out like this." The guy protested, saying there was nothing wrong, but Jack, along with a buddy, laid it on thick. 3 months, 6 at most, that's all he's got left, Jack told someone else who entered the room. "Skin cancer, this guy's a goner," and they all chuckled. "Glad you're not me, buddy." The man fled into the night, terrified he was dying, while Jack and his crew took everything he owned, since, after all, he wouldn't need it anymore. Standing in the shattered hallway, the creature's eyes glowed in the dead silence, its thirst quenched. It sensed a presence beyond the door and paused. The cat reared up, its weight pressing against the door, feeling it resist. It pushed harder, and with a groan, the door gave way. Wanamaker twisted its body, forcing the door open wider. Inside, Whistley jumped awake, disturbed by the creature's smell and the noise as it entered. The stench of decay filled the room, and Whistley's senses jolted into full alert as the nightmarish figure crawled through the door. Its yellow eyes locked onto him, and for a moment, he froze in terror, feeling his veins run cold as the beast's form loomed above him. His body went numb as the reality of the grotesque creature overwhelmed him, and his mind staggered. But then, as the animal hung halfway up the wall, his survival instincts kicked in. Whistley's fear mixed with a strange clarity, and he realized, for the first time in his life, how much he valued being alive. The animal, its grotesque form, its yellow eyes, its twisted body watched him, its presence a strange combination of terror and something deeper. Wanamaker had killed before, plenty of times, and the memories of its violence didn't faze him. The creature shifted off the wall and landed softly on the floor a few feet from Whistley. The man stared at it, his scream fractured and lost, but his body rigid with awareness. The streetlights outside reflected off the damp streets of Creek River, casting enough light into the room for Whistley to see the creature clearly. Wanamaker didn't look like any cat Whistley had ever seen. Its head resembled a pale, smooth bowling ball, wrapped in fur and leathery strips like bandages. Its lidless eyes glowed with a terrifying light above a grotesque mouth filled with gleaming fangs. Whistley gasped, horrified by the sight, but the creature lowered itself onto its paws and sat there, its bell tinkling softly. The noise pierced the thick silence, a stark contrast to the creature's horrifying appearance. Whistley, paralyzed by fear and disgust, held his breath. He watched as Wanamaker crept forward, its claws scraping the floor, and, impossibly, it began to purr. The sound, faint and broken, was hardly recognizable, but to Whistley, it was a lifeline. For the first time in his life, he clung to the sound of the purring, desperate to believe that he wasn't doomed. Wanamaker stared into Whistley's face, its yellowed eyes losing the edge of madness. The creature shivered with fear, afraid Whistley would push it away. The bell, once worn by a kitten in another lifetime, tinkled softly, bringing a strange joy to the moment. As the purring grew richer, Wanamaker's agony seemed to fade, and the madness that had driven it for so long slowly gave way to a strange, calming peace. It pressed against Whistley, seeking comfort, its body trembling with the weight of its past suffering. The sound of the bell grew louder, filling the room with its melody, a strange symphony that held Whistley frozen. He reached out, cautiously touching the creature's head, ignoring the horror that it represented. As he did, he noticed a small black tuft of blue fabric buried beneath its neck, a collar. Whistley's mind reeled. It couldn't be, but the memory came flooding back of a kitten, high on acid, crawling up walls, defying gravity, a deranged animal that had once been a laughingstock. And now, here it was again. Whistley cradled the dying creature, rocking it gently in his arms, whispering to it. He felt the pain and madness that had kept Wanamaker alive for so long beginning to fade, replaced by a fleeting sense of peace. For hours, Whistley held the cat, trying to warm it, comforting it as it trembled in his arms. In those final moments, Whistley was struck with the profound sorrow of it all. He held on to the little kitten that had turned into this twisted creature, torn between grief and guilt. His life, his world, and everything he had built seemed to collapse under the weight of his emotions. And as Wanamaker died, it fell asleep in his arms, at peace at last.